The cathedral smelled of white lilies and candle wax, and Celeste Moreau stood at the top of the aisle, feeling like a woman about to be buried alive in silk. 600 guests filled the pews of St. Adelina's, senators who owed the DeSantis family favors, men in tailored black suits who had never once raised their voices in public, women dripping in inherited diamonds who watched every bride with the same calculating hunger, waiting to see who would rise and who would fall. Celeste had grown up around this world without belonging to it. The daughter of a man who had died owing the wrong people money, and now, at 24, she was the answer to that debt, wrapped in a dress that cost more than her father's entire life. She was marrying Cassian DeSantis, the golden son. The one photographed at galas with a drink in one hand and a woman on his arm, always smiling, always charming, the kind of beautiful that made people forget to ask questions. Their engagement had been announced 8 months ago, brokered by his father, Salvatore DeSantis, and her late father's outstanding obligations. Dressed up in the language of love because that was easier for the newspapers to print than the truth. A debt paid in a body. She had told herself she could live with that. She had built, over 8 months, a careful architecture of resignation. She would be a good wife. She would smile at the right moments. She would learn to love a man who barely looked at her when the cameras weren't pointed his way. It wasn't happiness, but it was survival. And Celeste had learned a long time ago that survival was its own kind of grace. Then the doors at the front of the cathedral opened, and everything she had built came apart in less than a minute. Salvatore DeSantis walked in alone, not beside his son, not escorting him to the altar the way fathers did in these theatrical dynastic weddings, where every gesture was a message to the watching families. Alone, his face carved from something colder than Celeste had ever seen on him, and the murmur that spread through the pews told her before he even opened his mouth that something had gone catastrophically wrong. "There will be no wedding today," Salvatore said, his voice carrying easily to the back of the cathedral without him raising it at all. That was the thing about men like him. They never needed volume. "Not the wedding you were promised." Celeste's hands, folded in front of her, went cold inside her white gloves. "My son, Cassian." Salvatore paused, and in that pause Celeste watched 60 years of pride curdle into something that looked, for just a moment, like grief. "My son, Cassian, has betrayed this family. I will not stand here and pretend otherwise in front of people who will hear the truth by sundown regardless." The whispering rose. Celeste felt Father Anselm shift uncomfortably beside her, felt the weight of 600 pairs of eyes swinging between the empty space where a groom should have been standing and the woman left holding a bouquet of white roses that suddenly felt like evidence at a crime scene. "Cassian sold information to the Volkov family," Salvatore continued, and now his voice did rise, cracking on the edges like ice under weight. "Information that could have buried us. Information that nearly got 3 of my men killed last week in a shipment ambush that was not, as we believed, bad luck. It was betrayal, sold by my own blood for money he did not need, for reasons he has yet to explain to my satisfaction." Celeste's mind went white and empty. She thought of Cassian's easy laugh at their engagement dinner, how he'd poured her wine and told her she'd get used to this life, how he'd looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he intends to keep but never particularly wanted. This family does not fall because one man was weak, Salvatore said. This marriage will still happen today. This alliance will still be sealed, but not with Cassian. The cathedral had gone utterly silent. 600 people holding their breath in unison, and Celeste realized, with a sensation like falling, that every eye had shifted from Salvatore to the man now walking through the side entrance near the altar. A man she had met exactly twice in her life, and both times had left her unable to sleep that night. Dario de Santis did not walk like his brother. Cassian moved like a man performing for an audience, all loose charm and easy smiles. Dario moved like a blade being drawn from a sheath, economical, silent, final. He was taller than Cassian, broader through the shoulders, and where his brother's beauty was an invitation, Dario's was a warning. Black hair, a jaw that looked like it had been set once and never softened, eyes the colour of a winter lake just before it froze over completely. He wore black, always black, and today was no exception, even at his own brother's ruined wedding. A suit so precisely cut, it looked less like clothing and more like armour. He did not look at his father. He did not look at the guests. He looked at Celeste, and the look lasted exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds Celeste felt more thoroughly seen than she had in 8 months of engagement to his brother. "The man who will marry Celeste," Salvatore said, and the words landed in the cathedral like a verdict, "is Dario de Santis." The silence that followed was the loudest sound Celeste had ever heard. She looked at Dario. Dario looked back at her, and there was no surprise in his face at all, which meant he had known before he walked through that door, which meant this had been decided somewhere in a room she had never been invited into. Her entire future rearranged over coffee and cigars, while she stood here in white, waiting for a different man. "Father." Dario's voice was low, rough at the edges, the voice of a man who did not waste words on people who didn't need them. "This isn't the venue for this conversation." "There is no other venue," Salvatore snapped, and for the first time Celeste heard fear underneath his fury. "The Moreau debt must be honored today, or the alliance collapses, and every family watching us right now will smell blood in the water by tomorrow morning. You will marry her, Dario, today, or I will lose everything I have built, and you will lose the empire you've spent your entire life proving you deserve." Celeste's bouquet trembled in her hands. She looked at the priest, who looked helplessly at Salvatore. She looked at the pews, at the whispering guests already reaching for their phones beneath the cover of their programs. She looked, finally, back at Dario de Santis, the man the underworld called the Wolf of Manhattan behind his back and never to his face. And she understood, with the clean, cold clarity of someone watching their own life get rewritten in real time, that she had no vote in this. She had never had a vote. She had simply, until 60 seconds ago, believed she knew which cage she'd been sold into. Dario crossed the remaining distance between them. Up close he smelled like cedar and gunmetal, and his eyes, when they finally held hers, weren't cold at all. Not really. They were controlled, the way a fire is controlled behind glass, still burning, still capable of taking everything down if the glass ever cracked. Celeste Moreau. He said her name like he was testing the weight of it in his mouth. "I'm sorry for what my brother did to you. I am not sorry for what happens now. You don't even know me, she whispered, so only he could hear. No, he agreed, but I know exactly what I'm capable of protecting. Marry me today, and you'll never have to wonder if you're safe again. It should have sounded like a threat. Standing in that cathedral with 600 witnesses to the wreckage of her wedding and a stranger's ring about to replace the one she'd expected, it sounded horrifyingly, impossibly, like the truest promise anyone had ever made her. They were married 40 minutes later in front of the same 600 guests by the same trembling priest, with vows rewritten so quickly the ink on the revised marriage license was still tacky when Dario signed it. Celeste stood at the altar in the dress meant for another man's ring and repeated words she barely heard, her voice steady only because 2 decades of watching her mother perform grief and grace in equal measure had taught her how to keep a straight spine when everything beneath it was collapsing. Dario's voice, when he spoke his own vows, didn't waver once. He said, "I do," the way he seemed to say everything, like a fact being stated rather than a feeling being offered. When he slid the ring onto her finger, his hands were steady and warm and utterly unfamiliar, and Celeste thought, absurdly, that she didn't even know if he took his coffee black or sweet, and now she was his wife. The reception happened anyway, because cancelling it would have been its own kind of announcement, a crack in the fortress the DeSantis family had spent generations building. Celeste danced the first dance with a man she'd exchanged perhaps 40 words with in her entire life, his hand resting at the small of her back, with a pressure that was neither too tight nor too loose, calibrated, like everything about him, to project exactly the right amount of control. "You're doing well," he said, low, near her ear, as they turned beneath the chandeliers. "I'm doing what I'm told," Celeste said. "There's a difference." Something flickered behind his eyes, not quite amusement, something closer to respect. "Most people in your position would be crying by now." "Most people in my position didn't grow up watching their father lose everything to men exactly like your father," she said. "I learned young that crying doesn't buy you anything. It just tells the wolves you're wounded." His hand tightened almost imperceptibly at her waist. "And what do you think I am? A wolf?" "I think," she said carefully, watching his face for the reaction she couldn't yet predict, "that everyone in this room is too afraid to say your name above a whisper. I think that tells me everything I need to know." Dario didn't answer, but later, near midnight, when the guests had thinned to the family's inner circle and the champagne had turned warm in abandoned glasses, she caught him watching her from across the room while she spoke with his cousin Isabella, and the look on his face wasn't cold at all. It was something closer to a man recalculating a problem he'd thought he'd already solved. They left the reception together in a black car with tinted windows, and the silence between them stretched taut enough to hum. Celeste stared out at the city lights smearing past, wondering what came next. The wedding night that would follow, the intimacy that had been contracted rather than earned, and beneath it all, the low hum of terror she hadn't let herself feel yet, because there had been no room for it between the ceremony and the reception and the endless performance of composure. "I'm not going to touch you tonight," Dario said without looking at her. Celeste turned. "What?" "You heard me." His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the passing streets. This marriage exists to save my family's position. It doesn't require me to take anything from you that you haven't chosen to give. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, that will be a decision, not an obligation. You didn't seem concerned with my choices this afternoon, she said, and hated how bitter it came out, how much of the day's fear had curdled into something sharper now that the adrenaline was fading. He turned to look at her then, fully, and the weight of his attention was almost physical. No, he agreed. I wasn't. My father needed a wedding, and I needed my family's empire to survive the week. Those were not choices either of us made freely. But what happens inside our marriage from tonight forward, that's different. I don't take what isn't offered, Celeste, not from anyone, especially not from my own wife. She studied him in the passing light. The sharp planes of his face lit gold, and then dark, and then gold again, as they passed beneath street lamps. Why does that surprise me? Because everyone's told you I'm a monster, he said simply. And I am, to the people who deserve it. But you didn't do anything to me except get unlucky enough to be engaged to my brother. The car pulled into an underground garage beneath a building so tall Celeste couldn't see the top of it through the window, all glass and steel rising into the dark like something built to be seen from space. This was the DeSantis penthouse, Dario's penthouse, now hers as well, 60 floors above the city, a place she would learn to call home, while barely being able to call the man beside her a husband. There's a room prepared for you, Dario said, as the elevator carried them upward in smooth, silent ascent. Whatever you need, clothes, staff, anything, you tell Marta and it's handled. You are not a prisoner here. Aren't I? Celeste asked quietly. The elevator chimed. The doors opened onto a foyer of dark marble and low golden light, and Dario stepped out first, then turned back to look at her, still standing inside the car, as if he'd expected the question and had been dreading the moment he'd have to answer it honestly. You're safer here than you've ever been in your life, he said. I understand that isn't the same thing as free. I'm not going to insult you by pretending it is. It was, Celeste thought, as she finally stepped past him into the penthouse that would be her cage and her sanctuary in equal measure, the most honest thing anyone in this family had said to her all day. The penthouse was the kind of beautiful that made Celeste feel like an intruder in her own life. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering spine of the city, dark wood and darker leather, art on the walls that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than above a fireplace no one had ever lit. Her room, when Marta showed her to it near 2 in the morning, was 3 doors down from Dario's, connected by nothing but a shared hallway and an understanding neither of them had spoken aloud. She didn't sleep. She lay in a bed, still smelling faintly of fresh linen and unfamiliar detergent, staring at a ceiling she didn't recognize, replaying the moment Salvatore DeSantis had said her new husband's name like a sentence being handed down in a courtroom. By the time grey dawn light crept through the curtains, she'd resigned herself to functioning on no sleep at all, and dragged herself toward the kitchen in search of coffee, still in the silk robe Marta had left for her. Dario was already there. Of course he was. He sat at the kitchen island in a black t-shirt and grey sweatpants, reading something on a tablet with the focused stillness of a man who never did anything halfway, a cup of espresso steaming beside him. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted, Not quite softening, but adjusting, recalibrating for her presence, the way he seemed to recalibrate for everything. "Couldn't sleep," she said, because the silence demanded she say something. "Understandable." He nodded toward the espresso machine. "Marta stopped the kitchen for you. There's tea, if you prefer it. Coffee, if you don't." "Coffee's fine." She moved past him to the machine, aware of every inch of distance between their bodies, aware that he was tracking her movement even while pretending to read his tablet. "You're not what I expected." "No? Everyone talks about you like you're something out of a nightmare." She poured the coffee with hands that only shook a little. "Salvatore Wolfe, the DeSantis enforcer. I heard a woman at the wedding say you once had a man's hand removed for touching what wasn't his." Something in Dario's jaw tightened, and for a moment Celeste thought she'd finally found the monster underneath the composure. "That story's true," he said. "The man in question laid hands on a 15-year-old girl who worked in one of our restaurants. I don't apologize for what happened to him." Celeste's fingers stilled on the coffee cup. "Oh. You expected me to say it was an exaggeration," Dario said, watching her over the rim of his espresso. "It wasn't. I've done things in this life that would make you leave this penthouse and never look back if I told you all of them. I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make myself more palatable to you. But I don't hurt people who don't deserve it. That's the only line I've never crossed, and I intend to keep it that way. That's meant to be comforting." "It's meant to be true," Dario said. "Comfort is a luxury. I deal in facts." She sat across from him with her coffee, studying his face in the morning light, the faint shadow along his jaw, the exhaustion around his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept much either. "Tell me about Cassian," she said. "Tell me what he actually did. I deserve to know why my wedding turned into a coronation." Dario set down his tablet. For a long moment he said nothing, and Celeste watched him decide, in real time, how much truth he was willing to hand a woman he'd known for less than a day. "My brother has always resented being second," he said finally. "Our father built this family's power on discipline and fear in equal measure. I was raised to inherit that. Cassian was raised to be charming, to smile at senators and make deals over dinner, while I handled the parts of this business that require someone willing to get their hands dirty. He hated it. He spent years convincing himself that the empire should have been his, that charm should count for more than the willingness to do what's necessary. So he sold information to the Volkovs out of spite. Out of ambition, Dario corrected. He's been meeting with Nikolai Volkov's people for months. Whether he intended it as leverage against our father or as an outright betrayal, I don't know yet. What I know is that 3 of my men nearly died in an ambush last week because someone told the Volkovs exactly which route our shipment would take, and the only people with that information were inside this family." Celeste felt something cold settle in her stomach. "So it's not over, whatever Cassian started?" "No," Dario said, and for the first time his voice carried something that sounded almost like weariness. "It's not over, which is part of why this marriage happened the way it did. My father needed to send a message that this family doesn't fracture just because one son is weak, that the alliance with the Moreau name and everything it represents still holds. You became the proof of that, whether either of us wanted it or not." "I'm a message," Celeste said quietly. "You're my wife," Dario said, and something in the way he said it, flat, immovable, final, made her look up at him sharply. "Whatever else you are to this family, to my father, to the world watching us, in this house you are my wife. And that means something to me, even if it took a courtroom's worth of circumstance to make it true. I don't share what's mine, Celeste. I don't make promises I don't intend to keep. You'll learn that about me faster than you'll learn most other things. She didn't know, sitting there in the pale morning light, with coffee going cold in her hands, whether that promise should have frightened her or not. What she knew, with unsettling certainty, was that it didn't. 2 weeks into her marriage, Celeste learned that the DeSantis family conducted half its business inside a nightclub called Onyx, a cavernous, velvet-dark space in the meatpacking district that Dario owned outright and visited every Thursday night like a man attending to a second job that happened to come with bottle service. "You don't have to come," Dario had said that evening, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror while Celeste watched from the doorway of his room, the first time she'd been invited into that space at all. But it would be useful for people to see us together, publicly, as a united front. "I understand optics," she said. "I grew up around this world too, remember? Just from the outside." He'd looked at her then with something that might have been approval. "Wear something dark," he said. "Onyx doesn't forgive bright colours." She wore black, a dress that clung to her like a second skin, and when she walked into the club on Dario's arm 2 hours later, she understood immediately why he'd warned her. The room was full of the kind of danger that dressed itself up as glamour. Men in tailored suits who watched every entrance like they were calculating exits. Women who smiled with teeth too sharp to be entirely decorative, and a bassline thrumming low enough to feel in her sternum. Dario didn't let go of her hand once. He steered her through the crowd with a possessiveness that should have felt suffocating, and instead felt disconcertingly like the safest she'd been in weeks. His palm at the small of her back, his eyes cutting toward anyone who looked at her a second too long. It was in the VIP section, an hour into the night, that Celeste met Nikolai Volkov's daughter. "Celeste DeSantis," the woman said, extending a hand with rings on every finger, her accent thick and her smile thicker still. "I've heard so much about you, the bride who married the wrong brother and somehow came out ahead." "Anya," Dario said, his voice dropping into something with an edge Celeste hadn't heard from him before. "You weren't invited tonight." "I don't need an invitation to enjoy good music, Dario." Anya's eyes flicked over Celeste with an assessment that felt like being catalogued. "Your new wife is lovely. It's a shame about the circumstances. Cassian was always the more interesting one, wasn't he? Charming. Fun. Not," she gestured vaguely at Dario, "all this." "Careful," Dario said, and the single word carried more weight than a sentence from anyone else in the room. Anya laughed, low and unbothered, clearly a woman who had spent her whole life testing the exact limits of dangerous men and surviving. "Relax, I only came to pay respects. And to tell your wife that if she ever gets tired of the family business, my father's organization has always appreciated a woman who understands leverage." She left with a wink, disappearing back into the crowd, and Celeste felt Dario's hand tighten around hers, hard enough that she made a small sound of surprise. He released her instantly, jaw working, eyes tracking Anya's retreat with an intensity that bordered on violence. "She's fishing," he said, half to himself, testing whether Cassian's betrayal opened a door she can walk through. "Did it work?" Celeste asked. "Am I supposed to feel tempted?" Dario looked at her then, and whatever calculation had been running behind his eyes stilled completely. "No," he said. You're supposed to feel safe. That's the only thing I'm interested in you feeling tonight. They danced once, later, on a floor lit by nothing but the low red glow of hanging lanterns, and Celeste discovered that Dario DeSantis moved with the same economical precision on a dance floor as he did everywhere else. No wasted motion, no performance, just a controlled gravity that pulled her closer with every turn until she could feel the heat of him through the thin fabric of her dress. "You're staring," she said, her voice barely audible over the music. "I'm aware," he said. "Why?" His hand slid slightly lower on her back, a small transgression that felt enormous in the charged space between them. "Because every man in this room has looked at you tonight like they're calculating what it would cost to take you from me," he said, low, rough. "And I find I have very little patience left for watching it happen." "Jealousy," Celeste said, testing the word, "from the Wolf of Manhattan." "Possessiveness," Dario corrected, his eyes dark in the low light. "I don't share what's mine, Celeste. I told you that the first morning you woke up in my house. I meant it then. I mean it more now." She should have pulled away. Instead, she found herself leaning fractionally closer, close enough to feel his breath against her temple, close enough that when the song ended and he finally stepped back, the loss of contact felt like something being taken from her, rather than something being returned. The threats started small: a car that idled too long outside the penthouse building, a florist's delivery that arrived without an order attached, a note tucked inside Celeste's coat pocket after a charity gala that read only, "You should have run when you had the chance," in handwriting no one could identify. Dario doubled security within a day of the note. 2 guards now trailed Celeste everywhere outside the penthouse, silent and enormous, men named Enzo and Marco, who Celeste came to recognize by the particular way they scanned every room before letting her enter it. "This is Cassian," Dario said one night, pacing his study with the note in his hand, his face carved from granite. "Or the Volkovs, or both, working together in ways my father refuses to believe are possible." "Why would Cassian threaten me?" Celeste asked. "I never did anything to him except get abandoned by him." "Because you're mine now," Dario said, and the word landed with a weight that made her chest tighten. "Hurting you is the easiest way to hurt me, and my brother has spent his whole life looking for ways to prove he's capable of hurting me." She watched him for a long moment, this man who was still, 3 weeks into their marriage, more stranger than husband, and yet who paced his study at midnight with more fury on her behalf than she'd ever seen a man display over anything. "You're worried," she said. "I'm careful," he corrected. "Worry is for men who don't already have a plan." "And do you have a plan?" Dario stopped pacing and looked at her, and something in his expression softened at the edges, just slightly, just enough for Celeste to notice. "I have several," he said. "None of them involve losing you to a message written in someone's handwriting they were too cowardly to sign." It was the closest he'd come in 3 weeks to admitting that she'd become something to him beyond an obligation. Celeste felt the admission land somewhere beneath her ribs, warm and unwelcome, because falling for Dario DeSantis had never been part of the arrangement, and she wasn't at all certain her heart had gotten the memo. The following week, Salvatore summoned them both to the family estate in Westchester, a sprawling stone house that looked like it had been transplanted directly from the Tuscan countryside and dropped into the Hudson Valley by sheer force of will. Celeste had met Salvatore exactly once since the wedding. A stilted dinner where he'd studied her like a general assessing a newly acquired asset. And the summons filled her with a dread she couldn't quite name.
"Cassian wants to talk," Salvatore said without preamble, seated at the head of a dining table long enough to seat 20. "He claims he can explain everything, that the Volkov meetings were reconnaissance, not betrayal, that he was building a case against Nikolai's operation, not selling us out to it." "And you believe him?" Dario's voice was flat, controlled, but Celeste had learned enough in 3 weeks to hear the fury beneath the stillness. "I believe," Salvatore said carefully, "that this family cannot afford another war. And if there's a version of events where my son is a fool instead of a traitor, I would prefer that version to be true." "Convenient," Dario said, "that the version you prefer requires no consequences." "Do not lecture me about consequences," Salvatore snapped, some of his son's own fire flashing across his face. "I gave you an empire, Dario. I gave you a wife and a fortune and a family name that opens doors most men would kill for. The least you can do is hear your brother out before you decide he deserves whatever punishment you've already sentenced him to in that head of yours." The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Celeste sat silently, hands folded in her lap, watching father and son circle each other with the particular cruelty only families seemed capable of, and wondered, not for the first time, whether she'd married into a family or a war that had simply chosen for now to wear a family's face. "Fine," Dario said finally. "I'll hear him. But if he's lying, father, there will be no more protection I can offer him. Not from the Volkovs. Not from me." Salvatore's jaw worked, and for a moment Celeste saw, underneath the powerful patriarch, an old man terrified of losing a second son to a war the first had already survived. "That's all I ask," he said quietly. "One conversation, before either of you decides anything permanent." Later that night, in the car back to the city, Celeste watched Dario's hands tighten around the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. "You don't believe him," she said. "Cassian." "No," Dario said. "I don't." "Then why agree to the meeting?" Dario glanced at her, and in the passing streetlight his eyes looked almost haunted. "Because my father's right about one thing," he said. "I already sentenced Cassian in my head the moment he didn't show up to his own wedding. That's not justice. That's just anger wearing justice's clothes. I owe it to this family, and maybe to myself, to make sure I'm not about to destroy my own brother over a story I never let him finish telling." They met Cassian 3 days later at a private room above one of the family's restaurants in Little Italy, a space Celeste had never seen before. Dim lighting, a single round table, and 2 of Dario's men stationed outside the door like a promise of violence held in reserve. Cassian looked different than he had at their engagement dinner 8 months earlier. Thinner. His charm still there, but threadbare now, stretched over something anxious underneath. He stood when Celeste entered, an old reflex of manners that felt almost obscene given the circumstances. "Celeste," he said. "I owe you an apology I don't know how to give properly." "Save it," Dario said before she could respond, taking the seat across from his brother without ceremony. "You wanted to talk. Talk." Cassian's eyes flicked between them, and something in his expression cracked. Grief, Celeste thought, or the closest thing to it a man like Cassian allowed himself to show. "I've been meeting with Nikolai Volkov's people for 4 months," he said. "That part's true. I won't insult either of you by denying it. And the ambush," Dario said. "The shipment. 3 of my men nearly died." "I didn't authorize that," Cassian said, and his voice cracked on the word authorize like it had cost him something to say it. "I swear to you, Dario, I never gave them shipment routes. I was gathering information, trying to prove that Nikolai's people were the ones responsible for Father's shipment losses last year, the ones everyone blamed on bad luck and bad weather. I thought if I could bring Father proof that the Volkovs had been bleeding us for a year without consequence, it would finally—" He stopped, jaw tight. "Finally what?" Dario's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Finally prove I was capable of something," Cassian said, and the admission seemed to cost him more than anything else he'd said. "You've spent your whole life being the son Father trusts with the real work. I've spent mine being the son he trusts with dinner parties. I thought if I could hand him something real, a genuine victory against the Volkovs, it would change how he saw me, how everyone saw me." Celeste watched Dario's face carefully, looking for the fury she'd expected, and finding instead something more complicated. Recognition, maybe, of an ambition he understood, even while despising the method. "So you went behind everyone's back," Dario said, "met with the enemy, left your own wedding without a word to anyone, including the woman standing across from you right now, whose entire future you rearranged because you decided playing spy mattered more than showing up." "I know," Cassian said quietly. "I know what it cost her. I know what it cost this family. But someone inside our organization has been feeding information to the Volkovs for over a year, Dario, and it isn't me. I was trying to find out who before they did more damage than a cancelled wedding." The room went very still. Celeste felt the temperature of the conversation shift entirely. "You're saying there's someone else," Dario said slowly. "Someone inside the family, still active, still feeding information." "I'm saying I have a list of 6 people who had access to the information that got leaked over the past year," Cassian said. "And I'm saying that whoever it is, they're still in place, still trusted, still close enough to hurt us again, whenever they choose." Dario sat back, and Celeste watched something shift behind his eyes. The sharp recalculation of a man realizing the war he thought he understood had a second front he hadn't accounted for. "Give me the list," he said. Cassian slid a folded paper across the table, and Dario opened it slowly, scanning the names, his jaw tightening with each one. Celeste couldn't see the paper from where she sat, but she watched Dario's face carefully enough to see the exact moment his expression changed from anger to something colder, more focused, more dangerous. "You're certain about this?" Dario said. "As certain as I can be without proof," Cassian said. "That's what I was trying to get from the Volkovs. Proof. Instead, I got you thinking I sold out our family on my own wedding day." Dario folded the paper and slid it into his jacket. "I'm not forgiving you," he said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. You made a decision that put people's lives at risk and humiliated a woman who did nothing to deserve it. That's not something I forget because the story turned out to be more complicated than I assumed." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Cassian said. "I'm asking you to believe that whoever's actually responsible for this is still out there, and that they're not going to stop just because you found a convenient scapegoat in your own brother." Later, in the car, Celeste watched Dario stare at the folded list without opening it again, his thumb tracing the edge of the paper like he was bracing himself for whatever names were written inside.
"Do you believe him?" she asked.
"I don't know," Dario admitted, and the uncertainty in his voice was more unsettling than any of his anger had been.
"But I believe someone inside my family has been selling us out for a year. And I believe that person is still close enough to reach you whenever they choose. That's the only thing that matters right now."
Dario didn't sleep for 3 nights after that meeting. Celeste found him in his study each of those nights, surrounded by files and photographs, and the folded list Cassian had given him, cross-referencing names against shipment schedules and security logs, with a methodical focus that reminded her, unsettlingly, of a surgeon preparing for an operation he already knew would be bloody. "You should sleep," she told him on the 3rd night, standing in the doorway, in the oversized sweater she'd taken to wearing around the penthouse, watching him rub at eyes gone red with exhaustion. "I will," he said, "when I know which of these 6 people has been selling my family for scraps." She crossed the room and sat across from him, uninvited, and began reading the files upside down, with the patient attention of someone who had spent her whole life learning to read rooms she wasn't supposed to understand. "Talk me through it," she said. "Maybe another set of eyes helps." Dario looked up at her, surprised, and something in his expression shifted into an assessment she hadn't seen from him before. Not the careful calculation of a man protecting a fragile asset, but something closer to respect for an equal. "You want to help me find a traitor in my own organization?" "I want to help find the person who left a note in my coat pocket," Celeste said. "This stopped being purely your problem the moment it became mine, too." He studied her for a long moment, and then slowly began to talk, walking her through the 6 names, the timeline of leaked information, the pattern of losses that had bled the family's shipping operation for over a year. 2 of the names, Celeste learned, belonged to men who'd left the organization entirely months ago, no longer positioned to have caused the recent ambush. One was Salvatore's longtime accountant, a man who'd been with the family for 30 years and whose loyalty Dario dismissed almost immediately. That left 3 names. One was Marco, one of her own security detail, a possibility that made Celeste's stomach turn cold at the thought of a man who'd walked 3 steps behind her for weeks being the one who'd endangered her life. One was a cousin, Isabella's brother Thomas, who managed logistics for the family's shipping operations. And one was a name Celeste didn't recognize at all. Vittorio Conti, listed as a long-time advisor to Salvatore, a man who'd apparently been present at nearly every major family decision for the past decade. "Who's Vittorio Conti?" she asked. Something in Dario's face went very still. "My father's oldest friend," he said. "He was best man at my parents' wedding. He's been an advisor to this family since before I was born. My father trusts him more than he trusts most of his own children, which makes him the perfect person to betray you all without anyone suspecting," Celeste said quietly, watching the realization land on Dario's face like a physical blow. "If it's him," Dario said, his voice low and dangerous, "my father will never believe it without proof strong enough to survive a lifetime of loyalty standing in the way." "Then get the proof," Celeste said. Dario looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You're not what I expected," he said,
echoing, without seeming to realize it, the exact words she'd said to him weeks earlier in this same kitchen. When my father told me I'd be marrying you, I expected a woman who would need protecting from every corner of this world. I didn't expect someone who'd sit across from me at midnight, helping me hunt a traitor. I told you, Celeste said. I learned young that survival requires participation, not just endurance. I don't intend to be a woman who waits quietly in another room while the people around her decide her fate. Not again. Not after everything that's already been decided for me. Something shifted in Dario's expression, the careful control cracking just slightly, revealing something warmer underneath, something that looked almost like the beginning of genuine affection rather than obligation or possessiveness.
He reached across the table, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and closed his hand over hers where it rested against the file folder. "Thank you," he said, quiet and rough, "for staying up with me, for not asking me to be someone gentler than I am." "I don't want gentle," Celeste said, and meant it more than she'd expected to. "I want honest. You've been that with me since the morning after our wedding. It's more than I ever got from your brother in 8 months of engagement." His thumb traced small, absent circles against the back of her hand, and neither of them moved to pull away, the space between them charged with something that had nothing to do with survival or arrangement, and everything to do with the slow, dangerous process of two guarded people beginning to trust each other, despite every reason not to. "I need to find out if it's Vittorio," Dario said finally, breaking the moment with obvious reluctance. "Quietly, before he realizes we're looking." "Then let me help," Celeste said. "I've spent years watching men like your father hold court. I know how to listen in rooms where people forget I'm paying attention." Dario studied her for a long moment, and then, for the first time since the wedding, he smiled, small, real, and devastating in its rarity. "All right," he said, "wife and co-conspirator. I suppose there are worse arrangements a man could find himself in." The plan formed slowly over the following 2 weeks, a careful surveillance of Vittorio Conti that had to look, to everyone, including Salvatore, like nothing more than the ordinary business of running an empire. Celeste became, without either of them planning it precisely, an unlikely asset in that surveillance. As Dario's wife, she had access to social circles Vittorio moved through comfortably. Charity boards, gallery openings, the kind of gatherings where old men like Vittorio Conti relaxed their guard because they'd stopped believing a young woman in a beautiful dress could be listening for anything more dangerous than gossip. At a gallery opening in Soho, 3 weeks after the meeting with Cassian, Celeste found herself standing beside Vittorio at the open bar, engaging him in the kind of light conversation that made men underestimate exactly how carefully she was listening. "Your husband tells me nothing of family business," she said, sipping wine she had no intention of finishing. "I confess it makes me feel rather useless as a DeSantis wife. Everyone assumes I should understand this world, and instead I'm left guessing at half of what's happening around me." Vittorio, 60 and silver-haired, and possessed of the particular warmth that made him trusted by 3 generations of a family that trusted almost no one, patted her hand with grandfatherly affection. "Dario's always been protective," he said. "Even as a boy. He'd rather carry a burden alone than let someone he loves feel its weight." "Does he love easily?" Celeste asked, letting a note of genuine curiosity slip into the question, because in truth she wanted the answer for herself as much as for the investigation. "Dario doesn't do anything easily," Vittorio said, chuckling. But I've known that boy his whole life, and I've never seen him look at a woman the way he looks at you. Whatever this marriage started as, my dear, I don't think it's staying that way." It was, despite everything, a genuinely kind thing to say, and Celeste felt a flicker of guilt at using this warmth as cover for the suspicion Dario now carried toward this man. But guilt didn't stop her from steering the conversation gently toward the shipment routes Vittorio had helped negotiate over the years, the business relationships he'd cultivated with partners across Europe, the particular pride he took in decades of loyal service. "You must know everything about this family," she said, "every route, every partner, every secret." "More than most," Vittorio agreed, something flickering behind his eyes that Celeste couldn't quite name. Pride, perhaps, or something closer to satisfaction at being recognized for a lifetime of quiet, essential work. "Salvatore trusts me with things he wouldn't tell his own sons. That trust is the only thing I have left to be proud of at my age." Later that night, reporting the conversation to Dario in his study, Celeste watched his face darken with each detail. "He said Salvatore trusts him with things he wouldn't tell his own sons," she repeated. "That's not incriminating on its own, but combined with the timeline—" "He's had access to every route we've ever run," Dario said grimly, "for 30 years. If he's been selling that access, even in small pieces, even just occasionally, it would explain everything. The losses, the ambush, all of it." It was Enzo, 3 days later, who finally found the proof, a financial trail painstakingly reconstructed from offshore accounts and shell companies that connected Vittorio Conti to payments from a Volkov-controlled entity stretching back nearly 18 months. Small payments at first, almost negligible, and then larger ones in the past 6 months, coinciding exactly with the increased frequency of the family's shipment losses. Dario spread the documents across his desk at 2 in the morning, his face carved from stone as he reviewed evidence that implicated a man who'd been present at his own christening. "He's been bleeding us for 1.5 years, Dario said, voice flat with barely controlled fury. "My father's oldest friend. The man who taught me to shoot when I was 12 years old. He's been selling us out the entire time." Celeste stood behind him, one hand resting on his shoulder, feeling the tension coiled there like a wire pulled taut. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Dario said, "I have to walk into my father's house and tell him that the man he trusts more than his own children has been betraying this family for 18 months. And I have to do it with proof strong enough that he can't dismiss it out of grief or denial." "Do you think he'll believe it?" Dario was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents like they contained an answer he wasn't ready to accept. "I think," he said finally, "that my father is about to lose something he's never had to consider losing before. And I think that whatever happens next is going to be the most dangerous conversation of my life." Salvatore de Santis did not believe them at first. They sat in his study at the Westchester estate, Dario, Celeste, and Salvatore himself, the documents spread across the same table where Salvatore had once assessed Celeste like an asset, and watched the old man's face move through disbelief, anger, and finally a grief so raw it made Celeste look away out of something like mercy. 30 years. Salvatore said quietly, staring at the financial records that proved his oldest friend had betrayed him. 30 years, Dario. He was at your christening. He held you when you were an hour old. I know, Dario said, his voice gentler than Celeste had ever heard it. I know what he means to you. I wouldn't have brought this to you without absolute certainty. And Cassian's information led you here, Salvatore said, something bitter twisting through the words.
My son, who abandoned his own wedding, whose betrayal I was certain would destroy this family. He's the one who found the thread that led to the actual traitor. Cassian made mistakes, Dario said carefully. Serious ones. Going behind the family's back, meeting with the Volkovs without authorization, disappearing on his wedding day without explanation. None of that is forgivable simply because it turned out he wasn't entirely wrong about a traitor in our ranks. But he wasn't lying about Vittorio. The proof is right here. Salvatore sat in silence for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly as he touched the edge of the documents.
"What do you want to do?" he asked finally, looking at Dario with an expression Celeste had never seen on his face before. Not command, not fury, but something closer to a father asking his son for guidance instead of the reverse. "I want to bring him in," Dario said, quietly. "I want to hear him admit it, and I want to understand exactly how much damage he's done, and to whom, before we decide what justice looks like. And if he doesn't admit it, then the financial records speak for him," Dario said. "But I'd rather he tell us himself. For whatever's left of 30 years of friendship, Father, I think you deserve to hear it from him directly, rather than from a spreadsheet." Salvatore nodded slowly, and something in the gesture looked like surrender to a truth he could no longer avoid. "Do it," he said. "Bring him here. I want to look him in the eye when he confesses what he's done to this family." It took 4 days to arrange the confrontation, 4 days during which Dario doubled Celeste's security again, moved her to a secure floor of the penthouse with reinforced access, and barely slept at all, running through contingencies with the obsessive focus of a man who had learned over the previous weeks exactly how much he had to lose. "You don't have to be there," he told Celeste the night before, sitting across from her in his study, the exhaustion evident in the lines around his eyes. "Whatever happens with Vittorio, it could get ugly. I won't ask you to witness that." "You're not asking me," Celeste said. "I'm choosing. I've been in this family long enough now to have earned the right to see how it protects itself." Dario studied her for a long moment, and then reached across the table the same way he had weeks earlier, and closed his hand over hers. "When this started," he said quietly, "I told you I don't share what's mine. I meant it as possession, a claim, something closer to ownership than affection. And now? Now I understand it differently," he said, his thumb tracing slow circles against her knuckles, his eyes dark and unguarded in a way she'd rarely seen from him. "Now, when I say I don't share what's mine, I mean I've never in my life had something worth protecting the way I'm willing to protect you. Not the empire, not the family name. You." Celeste's breath caught, the words landing somewhere deep and unguarded, somewhere she hadn't let herself go since the day her father died, and taught her, brutally, that trusting anyone with your softness was a luxury the world didn't often forgive. "Dario," she started, uncertain what she meant to say next, but he shook his head slightly, a silent request for her not to answer yet, not until the danger circling them both had been dealt with, not until he could offer her something more permanent than a confession made at midnight in a study full of evidence against a dying friendship. "Not yet," he said softly. "Not until I know you're safe from everything this is about to unleash. But I needed you to know, before whatever happens tomorrow." She nodded, understanding, and let her hand remain in his long after the moment should have ended, both of them sitting in comfortable silence while the city glittered beyond the windows, oblivious to the war quietly reshaping itself,
just behind the glass. Vittorio Conti arrived at the Westchester estate believing he'd been summoned for an ordinary family dinner. Celeste watched from the study doorway as Dario greeted him with a warmth so convincing it made her chest ache. An embrace, a hand on the shoulder, the practiced ease of a man who had learned from his father exactly how to disarm someone before delivering a killing blow. "Vittorio," Salvatore said, rising from his chair as the old man entered the study, his voice carefully neutral. "Thank you for coming." "Of course, Salvatore. Always." Vittorio settled into a chair, glancing between father and son with the first flicker of unease, some ancient instinct perhaps sensing the room's temperature had shifted from anything ordinary. "What's this about? Your message sounded urgent." Dario slid the financial documents across the table without preamble, watching Vittorio's face with the focused, patient attention of a predator that had already won and was simply waiting for its prey to recognize the fact. Celeste watched the color drain from Vittorio Conti's face as he scanned the pages. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, the payments tracing back 18 months to the exact moment the family's shipment losses had begun. "Where did you get this?" Vittorio said, his voice gone thin and reedy, all the grandfatherly warmth evaporating in an instant, replaced by something cornered and desperate. "That's not the question you should be asking," Dario said quietly. "The question is whether you're going to tell my father the truth yourself, or whether you're going to make him hear it from a spreadsheet compiled by people who owe you nothing." Vittorio's hands trembled against the papers. He looked at Salvatore, and for a long, terrible moment, Celeste watched 30 years of friendship war visibly against the truth about to destroy it. "Salvatore," Vittorio began, his voice cracking, "you have to understand." "Understand what?" Salvatore said, and his voice was so quiet, so controlled, that it frightened Celeste more than any shouting could have. "Understand why you sold my family for money you didn't need, from a man who's been trying to destroy everything I built for 30 years? "I didn't sell you out for money," Vittorio said, and something in his tone shifted, desperation curdling into something closer to old, buried resentment. "Do you have any idea what it's like, Salvatore? 30 years advising you, 30 years watching you build an empire while I remained your advisor, your friend, your employee, in every way that mattered, even if you never called it that. I raised my own children on a fraction of what you've given your sons. I watched you hand Dario an empire while I received a pension and gratitude." "So you sold information to the Volkovs," Dario said, his voice dangerously flat. "Endangered my men. Nearly got 3 people killed in that ambush because you were jealous of a pension." "Because I was tired of being invisible," Vittorio snapped, some final wall crumbling entirely. "Nikolai Volkov offered me something your family never did, genuine partnership, a stake in something that would actually be mine, rather than another man's legacy I'd spend my whole life maintaining." Salvatore's hands, resting on the desk, curled slowly into fists. 30 years, he said again, quieter now, the fury giving way to something closer to devastation. "I trusted you with my sons' lives, with this family's survival, and you sold us out because you wanted to feel important." "I wanted to feel like more than furniture in your house," Vittorio said, and for the first time Celeste saw something almost pitiable in the old man's face. A lifetime of quiet resentment finally given voice, too late in the worst possible circumstances. "How much information did you give them?" Dario said. "Beyond the shipment routes, what else?" Vittorio was silent for a long moment, and Celeste watched something calculating flicker behind his eyes, even in the wreckage of his confession. A man still trying to decide how much truth would buy him mercy and how much would guarantee his death. "There's more," Vittorio said finally. "Nikolai isn't working alone. He has a partner inside your organization still. Someone beyond me. Someone who approached him first, before I ever got involved. I only ever knew a fraction of the operation. If you think this ends with me, Dario, you're going to lose more than shipment routes before this is over." The room went utterly silent, the weight of that revelation settling over all of them like a shroud, and Celeste felt Dario's entire body go rigid beside her. The careful control he'd maintained through the entire confrontation finally cracking under the sudden, terrible understanding that the conspiracy they'd just unravelled was only the surface of something far larger and far more dangerous than any of them had prepared for. "Who," Dario said, his voice gone dangerously quiet, "is the other person?" Vittorio's hands were shaking now, the last of his composure abandoning him entirely. "I don't know their name," he said. "Nikolai never told me. He kept us separate deliberately, insurance in case one of us was ever caught. All I know is that whoever it is has access closer to the center of this family than I ever did. Closer than an advisor's office. Closer than an advisor," Dario repeated slowly, and Celeste watched the implication land on him like a physical blow. "You're saying it's family? Blood?" "I'm saying I don't know," Vittorio said, "but the information they've provided over the past year, details about internal security rotations, about which lieutenants report directly to which of you, about your personal schedules, Dario, including your wedding. That's not information an outside advisor has access to. That's information from inside your own household." Celeste felt something cold spread through her chest. "My wedding," she said. "You're saying someone leaked details about the wedding itself?" "I'm saying the timing of everything that's happened since your marriage. The note in your coat, the car outside the penthouse. That's not the work of an old man with a spreadsheet full of shipping routes," Vittorio said. "That's someone who knows exactly where you are, exactly when, exactly how to reach you without tripping your security. I've been feeding Nikolai commercial information for a profit. Someone else has been feeding him something far more personal and far more dangerous." Salvatore, who had been silent through most of this exchange, finally spoke, his voice hollow with a horror that went beyond even the betrayal of his oldest friend. "You're saying someone inside my own house is threatening my son's wife?" "I'm saying I believe that's likely," Vittorio said. "Yes." Dario stood so abruptly, his chair scraped hard against the floor, and for a moment Celeste thought he might do something violent, the careful control that defined him finally shattering under the weight of a threat that had reached directly into his own home, aimed at the one person he'd sworn to protect above everything else. "Marco," Celeste said quietly, and every head in the room turned toward her. "You said the leaked information includes security rotations. Marco's been part of my detail since the threat started. He'd know my schedule better than almost anyone." Dario's jaw tightened. "I don't want it to be him," he said. "He's been with this family since he was 19.
I trained him myself."
"I know," Celeste said gently. "But you taught me something a few weeks ago, sitting in your study at midnight. You said proof matters more than instinct, that we owe it to the people we love to make sure before we condemn anyone." Dario looked at her for a long moment, something raw and grateful passing behind his eyes, even in the middle of a crisis, and nodded slowly. "We investigate him," he said, quietly, "the same way we investigated Vittorio. No accusations until we have proof." Vittorio, watching this exchange with something like resignation, cleared his throat. "There's something else," he said. "Something I should tell you, given everything else I've already confessed." "What?" Salvatore said, his voice hollow. "Nikolai mentioned once that his eventual goal wasn't simply weakening your shipping operations," Vittorio said. "He wants the DeSantis empire itself, not just wounded, absorbed. He's been positioning for over a year to take control of your territories entirely, using the information he's gathered to engineer a collapse from within rather than a war fought from outside. The ambush, my information. Whatever this second source has provided, it's all pieces of a larger plan to make this family destroy itself so thoroughly that Nikolai can simply walk in and claim what's left." The silence that followed was absolute. Celeste watched Dario absorb this information with the particular stillness of a man recalculating an entire war he'd believed until this moment he understood the shape of. "Take him," Dario said finally, gesturing toward Vittorio, and two of his men stepped forward from the doorway where they'd been waiting, silent witnesses to the old man's confession. "Somewhere secure. He doesn't leave our custody until we understand exactly how deep this goes." As Vittorio was led from the room, his shoulders bowed under the weight of 30 years of friendship, finally and irreversibly destroyed. Salvatore sat in silence, staring at nothing, an old man confronting the reality that the empire he'd spent his life building had been quietly, patiently besieged from within for over a year without his knowledge. "Dario," he said finally, his voice smaller than Celeste had ever heard it, "find whoever else is involved, whatever it costs, whoever it turns out to be. I need to know my family is safe before I can sleep again." Dario nodded once, his hand finding Celeste's without seeming to think about it, an instinctive gesture of protection that had become, over the past weeks, entirely natural between them. "I will," he said, "and I promise you this. Whoever's threatening my wife will regret it long before this is over." The investigation into Marco took 8 days. 8 days during which Celeste found herself unable to look at the man who trailed 3 steps behind her for weeks without wondering whether he was protecting her or reporting on her every movement to men who wished her harm. It was Enzo who finally cleared him. A careful reconstruction of Marco's finances, his communications, his movements over the past 18 months, revealing nothing but the ordinary life of a loyal soldier with no hidden accounts, no unexplained contact with Volkov associates, nothing beyond a man who took his job seriously enough to have memorized Celeste's schedule out of professional diligence rather than betrayal. "It's not him," Dario said, relief evident in his voice as he reviewed Enzo's final report in his study, Celeste seated beside him. "Which means we're back to 6 names, minus Vittorio, minus the 2 who left the organization months ago, minus Marco. That leaves the accountant and Tomas, Isabella's brother, Celeste said quietly, remembering the woman she'd spoken with at her own wedding reception, the warmth Isabella had shown her in the weeks since, an unlikely friendship forming between two women who'd both married into a family neither had fully chosen. She'll be devastated if it's him. I know, Dario said grimly, which is exactly why I need to be certain before I say a word to her. It took another week of careful, quiet investigation before the truth emerged. Not through financial records this time, but through a single conversation Celeste had with Isabella over coffee, during which Isabella mentioned, entirely without suspicion, that Thomas had been unusually anxious lately, taking calls in private, avoiding family dinners he'd never missed before. He's been different since the wedding, Isabella said, stirring sugar into her coffee, oblivious to the way Celeste's posture had gone rigid beside her. Distracted. I asked him about it, and he said it's just business stress. But Thomas has handled logistics for this family for 6 years. He's never been stressed like this before. Celeste relayed the conversation to Dario that evening, watching his face harden with the particular grief of a man about to confirm a suspicion he'd hoped, against reason, would prove false. It took another confrontation, another study, another round of documents laid out like evidence at a trial, before Tomas finally confessed. Not out of the same bitter resentment that had driven Vittorio, but out of something closer to desperation. A man drowning in gambling debts he'd hidden from his family for over a year. Debts that had eventually attracted the attention of men connected to Nikolai Volkov, who had offered him a way out of his debts in exchange for information he told himself at first was harmless. I never meant for anyone to get hurt, Thomas said, his voice breaking. Isabella standing frozen in the doorway, having insisted on being present, despite Dario's attempts to spare her the confession. I gave them small things at first, nothing that mattered, I told myself. And then it became impossible to stop, because they had proof of what I'd already given them, and threatened to expose me to the family if I didn't keep providing more. You told them about the wedding, Dario said, about Celeste's schedule, about the security rotations that put her at risk. I didn't know they'd use it that way, Thomas said, weeping now, Isabella's silence in the doorway more devastating than any accusation could have been. I swear to you, Dario, I didn't know they'd threaten her directly. I thought it was just information, just numbers on a page. I didn't understand what it would become. It became a threat against my wife's life, Dario said, his voice low and lethal. Whatever you told yourself to make this feel survivable, Thomas, the truth is you sold this family's safety for gambling debts, and Celeste nearly paid the price for your weakness. Isabella finally spoke from the doorway, her voice raw with a grief that made Celeste's chest ache in sympathy. How long, she said, how long have you been lying to me? To all of us. Isabella, how long? She said again, and Thomas's silence was answer enough. It was Salvatore, ultimately, who decided Thomas's fate. Not death, as the old codes of the family's history might have once demanded, but exile, permanent and absolute. Banished from the family's business and its protection alike, left to face whatever debts and consequences awaited him without the shield of the DeSantis name he'd betrayed. He's still family, Salvatore said quietly when Dario questioned the mercy of the sentence. Weak, foolish, a man who let debt make his decisions for him, but not a man who wanted anyone dead. That has to matter, even now.
Celeste watched Dario accept his father's judgment with visible reluctance, understanding, even as he disagreed, that the man beside her carried his own code of justice, one that recognized the difference between malice and weakness, even when both produced the same devastating consequences. But even with Tomas exiled and Vittorio in custody, the deeper conspiracy Vittorio had warned of, Nikolai Volkov's plan to absorb the DeSantis empire entirely, engineered through years of patient infiltration, remained unsolved, a threat still circling somewhere beyond their reach, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. In the weeks that followed Tomas's exile, something shifted in the DeSantis penthouse that neither Celeste nor Dario acknowledged directly, though both of them felt it settle over their shared life, like a change in the weather, too gradual to name in the moment it occurred. Dario began seeking her out in small, deliberate ways. A cup of tea left beside her reading chair without comment, a habit he'd apparently noticed and decided to accommodate without being asked. A driver arranged for her charity board meetings before she'd mentioned needing one. A conversation late one evening about her father, the first time he'd asked about her life before the DeSantis family had absorbed it entirely. "He was a good man," Celeste said, curled into the corner of the study sofa while Dario worked through paperwork at his desk, the fire he'd finally learned to light casting gold light across the room. Not a smart one, when it came to money, but good. He used to read to me every night, even after my mother left, even when we couldn't afford the electricity to keep the lights on past 9. "What happened to him?" Dario asked, setting down his pen entirely, giving her his full attention in a way she'd come to recognize as rare and valuable, a currency he spent carefully. "He borrowed from the wrong people," Celeste said. "Tried to save our house, ended up owing a debt he could never repay to men who eventually decided my father's life was worth less than the money he owed them." She looked up at Dario, steady despite the old grief still sharp at the edges. "That's how I ended up promised to your brother. My father's debt transferred to your family in exchange for protection my mother desperately needed after he died. I was the payment plan." Dario's jaw tightened, something fierce and protective moving behind his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, "that anyone made you a currency instead of a person." "You did the same thing," Celeste pointed out, though gently, without accusation. "The day of my wedding. You married me because your family needed the alliance to survive." "I did," Dario agreed, "and I've spent every day since wondering how I ever convinced myself that was an acceptable thing to do to another human being, regardless of the circumstances that demanded it." Celeste crossed the room slowly, some old caution finally giving way beneath weeks of small kindnesses and hard-won trust, and settled into the chair across from his desk. "And now?" she asked. "Do you still see me as a currency? An alliance sealed in a cathedral?" Dario reached across the desk, closing his hand over hers with the same deliberate gentleness he'd shown since the night he'd first admitted he had something worth protecting beyond the empire itself. "Now," he said, his voice low and rough with something he'd clearly been holding back for weeks. "I see a woman who sat up with me at midnight, hunting a traitor in my own family. I see someone who speaks to my father's oldest friend, with enough patience to draw out a confession I never could have gotten myself. I see someone braver than half the men I've trained to survive this world. And I find myself terrified, Celeste, by how much I've come to need you here." "Terrified," Celeste repeated softly.
I built my entire life around control, Dario said. Around never needing anything I couldn't protect through sheer force of will. And then my father put you in front of me in a cathedral and told me to marry you to save an empire. And somewhere in the past 2 months, without my permission, you became the only thing in this world I'm not entirely certain I could survive losing. The silence between them stretched taut, charged with something neither of them had said aloud, despite weeks of small gestures building toward exactly this moment. Celeste felt her own heart hammering against her ribs, felt the old caution warring against a desire she could no longer pretend didn't exist. "Dario," she said, "I think I fell in love with you, somewhere between the note in my coat pocket and the night you told me you don't share what's yours. I don't know exactly when. I only know it happened despite every reason I had not to let it." He rose from behind the desk and crossed to her slowly, giving her every chance to stop him, the way he always did, and when she didn't, his hand came to rest against her jaw with a gentleness that contradicted everything the world believed about the Wolf of Manhattan. "I love you," he said, the words rough and unpracticed in his mouth, a man who clearly hadn't said them in longer than he could remember, if ever. "I loved you before I understood what I was feeling. I think I loved you the moment you looked at me across that cathedral and didn't flinch, even though every reason you had told you to." When he kissed her, it was nothing like the careful, controlled man she'd married. It was hungry and desperate and entirely unguarded. Two people who had spent their whole lives building walls, finally choosing, deliberately, to let one crumble. The peace lasted 3 weeks, long enough for Celeste to believe, foolishly, that the worst of the danger had passed with Vittorio's arrest and Thomas's exile. Long enough for her and Dario to build something that felt, despite everything, like an actual marriage rather than an arrangement forced by circumstance. The attack came on a Tuesday, ordinary and unremarkable, until it wasn't. Celeste had gone, against Dario's careful instructions, to a charity luncheon without her full security detail. Enzo had been reassigned that morning to handle an emergency at one of the family's warehouses, and Marco alone had seemed sufficient for a lunch surrounded by wealthy donors and charity board members in a hotel Dario's own family had used for a decade. It wasn't sufficient. The men who took her from the hotel's private parking garage moved with a coordination that told Marco, too late, that this had been planned for weeks. A diversion at the entrance, a blind spot in the garage's security cameras that shouldn't have existed. 3 men who overwhelmed Marco before he could reach for his weapon, and a van that pulled away from the hotel before anyone inside realized what had happened. Celeste fought. She'd promised herself, the day of her wedding, that she would never again be a woman who simply endured whatever the world did to her, and she held on to that promise, even as rough hands forced her into the van, even as a hood dropped over her head, even as the van pulled away from everything familiar and drove for what felt like hours into a darkness she couldn't measure. When they finally removed the hood, she was in a warehouse she didn't recognize, tied to a chair, facing a man she'd never met in person, but recognized instantly from photographs Dario had shown her weeks earlier during the investigation into Vittorio. "Nikolai Volkov," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mrs. DeSantis," Nikolai said, something almost admiring in his tone. "Or should I say, the woman who's caused me considerably more trouble than I anticipated when this all began. Vittorio in custody, Tomas exiled, both of my investments in your family's collapse wasted because a woman who was never supposed to matter decided to start helping her husband hunt traitors. You wanted the empire, Celeste said, piecing it together even through her fear. Not just the shipping routes. The whole thing. I've wanted it for 3 years, Nikolai said, circling her slowly, his footsteps echoing against concrete. Salvatore DeSantis has held territory in this city that should belong to my family, by every measure of history and blood. I've been patient, I've been thorough, and I would have succeeded if your husband hadn't been foolish enough to fall in love with the one piece of leverage capable of unraveling my entire plan. So now what? Celeste said. You kill me? You think that ends this? I think, Nikolai said, crouching in front of her chair so their eyes were level, that Dario DeSantis will burn his entire empire to the ground trying to get you back. And in the chaos that follows, there will be nothing left standing strong enough to stop me from claiming whatever's left. You're not the target, Mrs. DeSantis. You're the detonator. Celeste held his gaze despite the fear coiling in her stomach, despite the restraints cutting into her wrists, despite every instinct telling her to beg or plead or offer whatever bargain might buy her survival. She thought of Dario's hands cradling her face 2 nights earlier, of the words he'd said that had felt, for the first time in her life, like a promise she could actually trust. You don't know him, she said quietly. If you think destroying me destroys him, you don't understand what you're dealing with at all. Nikolai smiled, cold and satisfied. We'll see, he said. Send the message, he called to one of his men. Let Dario DeSantis know exactly what it will cost him to get his wife back. As they dragged her toward a separate room to photograph proof of her captivity for the message they intended to send, Celeste focused on the one thing keeping her fear from swallowing her whole entirely. Somewhere in the city, Dario was already discovering she was missing, and whatever else was true about the man she'd married, she knew with absolute certainty that he would tear the world apart to find her. Dario received the news 40 minutes after the abduction, when Marco, bloodied, furious, and half out of his mind with guilt, called him directly instead of going through proper channels, unable to bear the delay a moment longer. She's gone, Marco said, his voice cracking. 3 men, professional. They took her from the garage. I fought them, Dario. I swear to God I fought. But there were 3 of them, and... Where? Dario said, and the single word carried a fury so absolute that Marco's voice broke entirely on the other end of the line. Celeste would learn, much later, that the following 6 hours became the stuff of legend within the DeSantis organization, a story told in hushed, reverent tones by men who had spent their careers believing nothing could shake Dario DeSantis's legendary control, and who watched that day as the Wolf of Manhattan became something closer to an actual force of nature. He called every contact he possessed. He mobilized every soldier loyal to his family, pulling men from warehouses and nightclubs and quiet surveillance postings across the city, assembling a force large enough to level a small army. He personally interrogated 3 low-level Volkov associates within the first 2 hours, extracting information with a ruthless efficiency that would have terrified Celeste had she been present to witness it, though she suspected, given everything she'd learned about her husband, that she would have understood it too. Salvatore arrived at the penthouse within the hour, his face ashen, offering every resource the family possessed without hesitation. Whatever you need, he told his son. Whatever it costs, bring her home. It was Cassian, surprisingly, who provided the breakthrough. Showing up at the penthouse unannounced, his relationship with his brother still fractured and uncertain since the wedding, but arriving nonetheless with information gathered from his own remaining Volkov contacts, people who didn't yet know he'd been cut off entirely from Nikolai's operation. "There's a warehouse," Cassian said, spreading a hastily sketched map across Dario's desk. "In the industrial district, near the old rail yards. Nikolai's people have been using it for months for off-book storage. If he's holding her anywhere, it's there." Dario looked at his brother for a long moment, weeks of anger and betrayal warring visibly against the desperate need to trust any lead that might bring Celeste home. "Why are you helping?" he said. "After everything." "Because whatever's between us," Cassian said, "she never did anything to deserve this. And because you're my brother, Dario, whatever else that means right now. I'm not going to sit at home while Nikolai Volkov uses your wife as bait to destroy everything our family's built." Dario nodded once, and the two brothers, estranged and wary, but united by something that ran deeper than their conflict, began assembling a plan to take the warehouse by force. The assault happened at nightfall, 30 of Dario's men moving in coordinated silence around the perimeter of a warehouse that Nikolai Volkov, in his arrogance, had believed remained hidden from the family he'd spent years trying to destroy. Dario led the breach himself, refusing every attempt by his men to keep him back from the initial danger, moving through the warehouse's dark corridors with a focused, lethal calm that Celeste would later say frightened her more than anything Nikolai Volkov had done, because it represented a version of her husband capable of ending a man's life without hesitation the moment that man threatened what he loved. He found her in a back room, still tied to a chair, bruised but alive, and the sound he made upon seeing her, something between relief and fury, a sound Celeste had never heard from him before and would never forget, told her everything she needed to know about how close this had come to a very different ending. "I'm here," Dario said, crossing the room in 3 strides, cutting her restraints with hands that trembled despite his otherwise absolute control. "I'm here, Celeste. I've got you. I'm not letting anyone touch you again." "Dario," she started, but he pulled her into his arms before she could finish, holding her with a desperate intensity that spoke louder than any words could have, his face buried against her hair, his entire body shaking with the aftermath of 6 hours spent believing he might lose the only thing he'd ever truly wanted to protect. Somewhere in the warehouse beyond the room, gunfire erupted. Nikolai Volkov's remaining men attempting a final, desperate defense against 30 soldiers who had come prepared to burn the entire operation to the ground rather than leave without the woman they'd come to retrieve. Nikolai Volkov was captured alive, though barely. Dario's men had shown considerably more restraint than the situation might have warranted, a decision Celeste would later learn was deliberate, calculated specifically to ensure Nikolai survived long enough to answer for everything he'd orchestrated. They brought him to the Westchester estate, to the same study where Vittorio had confessed weeks earlier, and Celeste, despite Dario's insistence that she rest after her ordeal, refused to be anywhere but present for whatever came next. "You should be in bed," Dario told her, his hand never leaving hers since the moment he'd found her in that warehouse, an anchor neither of them seemed willing to release. "I need to see this," Celeste said. "I need to watch this end, Dario. I can't heal from something that isn't finished yet." Nikolai Volkov,
bound and blooded, showed none of the arrogant confidence he'd displayed hours earlier when Celeste had faced him tied to a chair in his own warehouse. Whatever composure he'd carried into that confrontation had been stripped away entirely by the speed and ferocity of Dario's response, by the realization that his carefully constructed plan to absorb the DeSantis empire had collapsed within a single night. "You should have killed her," Salvatore said quietly, standing over the man who'd spent 3 years trying to destroy his family. "If you'd killed her the moment you took her, you might have actually broken my son. Instead, you gave him time to find you, and now you're going to answer for every year you spent bleeding this family from the shadows."
"Kill me then," Nikolai said, some last flicker of defiance surfacing even now. "You'll gain nothing from my death that you haven't already gained from destroying my operation." "I'm not going to kill you," Dario said, and something in his voice made even Nikolai go still with sudden uncertainty. "Death would be a mercy, and you don't deserve mercy for what you did to my wife. Instead, you're going to watch everything you built collapse. Every territory you've claimed, every alliance you've cultivated, every piece of the empire you thought you were about to inherit. All of it is going to belong to me by the end of this month, taken piece by piece, while you sit somewhere secure enough that you'll never be able to stop watching it happen." The threat landed with more weight than any promise of violence could have, and Celeste watched Nikolai's face crumble as he understood, finally, exactly what kind of enemy he'd made in Dario DeSantis. Not a man who dealt in quick, merciful violence, but one who understood that true destruction required patience, and that the most lasting punishment was watching everything you'd built dismantled piece by piece, while you remained powerless to stop it. Over the following weeks, that promise proved entirely accurate. Dario, working alongside his father and, tentatively, his brother Cassian in a fragile reconciliation neither of them acknowledged directly, systematically dismantled Nikolai Volkov's operation across the city, absorbing his territories, turning his remaining loyal associates, exposing his business dealings to law enforcement contacts the DeSantis family had cultivated for decades. Within 6 weeks, the Volkov organization that had spent 3 patient years working toward the DeSantis family's collapse ceased to exist entirely. Its founder, held in a location known only to Dario and a handful of his most trusted men. Alive, but utterly, permanently powerless. Vittorio Conti, in the aftermath of the reckoning, was given a choice Celeste hadn't expected Salvatore to offer: exile rather than execution. The same mercy shown to Tomas, though delivered with considerably more grief, given the 30 years of friendship that preceded the betrayal. "I don't do this because I forgive you," Salvatore told him in the last conversation the two men would ever have. "I do this because some part of me still remembers who you were before resentment consumed you. Go somewhere far from this family, Vittorio, and never let me see your face again." It was, Celeste thought, watching Salvatore's face during that final conversation, a mercy that cost the old man more than execution would have, a final act of grief for a friendship that had been for 30 years one of the few things in his life not built on power or fear. The weeks following the warehouse and the collapse of Nikolai Volkov's operation passed in a quieter rhythm than Celeste had experienced since her wedding day. The danger, for the first time in months, genuinely behind them, rather than circling patiently in wait. She woke most mornings to find Dario already awake beside her, watching her sleep with an expression she'd once have called possessive and now recognized as something gentler underneath. A man still not entirely convinced, even weeks later, that the woman beside him was truly safe, still occasionally reaching for her in the middle of the night, as though confirming she remained exactly where he'd left her. "You have to stop doing that," she told him one morning, laughing softly as she caught him watching her over his coffee cup for the third time that week. "I promise I'm not going to disappear the moment you look away." "I know," Dario said, though something in his voice suggested the fear hadn't fully released its grip yet. "It's going to take time, Celeste. 6 hours believing I might lose you isn't something that heals in a few weeks." "Then we heal together," she said, crossing to sit beside him, resting her head against his shoulder in a gesture that had become, in recent weeks, entirely natural between them. "Slowly, however long it takes." Their relationship with Cassian, tentative and uncertain since the warehouse rescue, began slowly to find its own new equilibrium. He visited more frequently, no longer the golden, careless son who'd abandoned his own wedding, but something more grounded, a man who'd learned through catastrophic failure exactly what mattered and what didn't. He and Dario never fully repaired the trust his betrayal had broken, but they built something new in its place, wary and careful, two brothers learning to work alongside each other rather than in competition. "I owe you an actual apology," Cassian told Celeste one evening, the three of them sharing dinner at the penthouse for the first time since the wedding disaster months earlier. "Not the half-formed one I gave you in that restaurant, a real one. I left you standing at an altar because I was chasing something I thought would finally make me matter to this family. And in doing so, I handed you over to circumstances that nearly got you killed. I don't know how to make that right." "You don't have to make it right," Celeste said, surprising herself with how genuine the forgiveness felt after everything. "You gave me Dario, in a strange, roundabout way. I don't know if I'd call that a debt owed or a debt paid, honestly. Maybe both." Cassian looked between them, his brother's hand resting naturally at Celeste's waist, the ease that had grown between two people who'd started as strangers, forced together by circumstance, and become, somehow, genuinely devoted to each other. And something in his expression softened into what looked, for the first time since Celeste had known him, like real peace.
"I'm glad," he said simply. "Whatever else happened, I'm glad it led here." Isabella, too, found her way back into their circle over those months, her grief over Thomas's betrayal slowly giving way to a fierce loyalty toward the family that remained, particularly towards Celeste, who had never once treated her with suspicion despite her brother's crimes. "You could have hated me," Isabella told her once, over coffee in Celeste's favourite cafe near the penthouse. "Guilt by association. It would have been understandable." "You didn't do anything wrong," Celeste said simply. "Your brother made choices that were his own. I learned a long time ago that people don't inherit each other's sins just because they share blood. If I believed otherwise, I'd have to hate half the DeSantis family for things Salvatore did before any of us were born." It was during those quiet months of healing that Dario finally took her somewhere she hadn't expected. Not a nightclub or a gala or any of the glittering, dangerous spaces that had defined their public marriage, but a small house upstate, modest and unassuming, tucked into a valley far from the city's glass towers. I bought this before I knew you, he told her, as they walked together through rooms still mostly empty of furniture. Before my father told me I'd be marrying you. I bought it because I needed somewhere that wasn't about the empire. Somewhere I could imagine a life that belonged only to me. I never brought anyone here. Not once. Why bring me now? Celeste asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Because I want a version of us that exists outside all of it, Dario said, turning to face her in the fading afternoon light. The empire, the danger, the family obligations. I want a place where we're just Dario and Celeste, not the DeSantis heir and the wife who saved his family. I want to build something here that belongs entirely to us. The peace lasted 4 months before the Empire came calling again, this time in a form neither Dario nor Celeste had anticipated. Salvatore's health, which had been quietly declining since the confrontation with Vittorio, finally forced a reckoning the old man had been delaying for years. A heart condition, worsened by decades of stress and the particular grief of betrayal by his oldest friend, left him unable to continue running the family's operations with the vigor the position demanded. I need to name a successor, Salvatore told Dario and Cassian, both gathered in the Westchester Estates study for a conversation that felt, immediately, like the most consequential of their lives. Not eventually, now. My doctors tell me I have perhaps a decade left if I'm careful, less if I continue carrying the weight of this empire on my own shoulders. The obvious choice, everyone in the room understood, was Dario, the son who had spent his entire life training for exactly this responsibility, who had proven over the past year an ability to navigate crisis and betrayal that Cassian's more recent redemption couldn't yet match. But Celeste, watching Dario's face during that conversation, saw something she hadn't expected. Hesitation. A flicker of something that looked almost like reluctance, present in a man who had spent his entire life believing this exact moment was his singular purpose. That night, in the quiet of their bedroom, she finally asked him directly. "You don't want it," she said. "The Empire. I saw your face today, Dario. That wasn't the expression of a man receiving everything he's worked for his whole life." Dario was silent for a long moment, staring out at the city lights beyond their window. "I've spent my entire life believing that leading this family was the only thing that could ever give my life meaning," he said finally. "That being useful to my father, being feared by my enemies, being powerful enough to protect everyone under my control, that was the whole purpose of my existence. And then you came into my life, and I built something with you that has nothing to do with power or fear. And for the first time, I understand that there might be a version of my life that isn't defined entirely by this empire." "What are you saying?" Celeste asked quietly, though her heart had already begun to understand. "I'm saying I don't know if I want to spend the rest of my life the way my father has," Dario said, "making the kind of choices that leave him at the end of it mourning a friend he had to destroy and grieving a son he had to exile. I want to protect this family. I want to make sure Nikolai Volkov's kind of threat never touches us again. But I don't know if that requires me to become exactly what my father became. A man who sacrificed everything soft in himself for the sake of an empire." "And Cassian?" "Cassian spent the past year proving he's capable of more than anyone gave him credit for," Dario said. "He helped find you in that warehouse. He's been rebuilding trust with everyone he betrayed, slowly, patiently, in a way that suggests he's finally grown into someone worth trusting with real responsibility."
Maybe the empire doesn't need me to be its next head. Maybe it needs both of us, in different ways, doing the work we're each actually suited for. Celeste studied him for a long moment, understanding, with a clarity that made her chest ache, exactly what he was contemplating. "You want to step back," she said. "Let Cassian lead." "I want a choice," Dario said. "For the first time in my life, I want to choose what my future looks like, instead of simply accepting the role I was born into. And the thing I keep coming back to, Celeste, every time I try to imagine that future, you're in every version of it. Not the Empire. You." The conversation with Salvatore, when it finally happened 3 days later, was among the most difficult of Dario's life. A son explaining to a dying father's legacy that he wanted something other than the throne he'd spent his whole existence being prepared to inherit. "You're certain?" Salvatore said, studying his son with an expression that held more surprise than anger. "You want to give this to your brother, after everything he did?" "I want to build a life that isn't defined entirely by this family's survival," Dario said. "I'll always protect what's ours. I'll always be here if Cassian needs me, if this family faces another threat like Volkov. But I don't want to spend the rest of my life the way you have, Father, making the choices you've had to make. I want something more for myself, for Celeste, for whatever family we build together." Salvatore was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something Celeste had never heard from him before. Something that sounded, remarkably, like relief. "I always wondered," he said slowly, "whether I'd taken something from you, forcing you into this role before you'd ever had the chance to want anything else. I'm glad, Dario, that you found something worth wanting more." Cassian's ascension to head of the DeSantis family happened quietly, without the fanfare that might once have accompanied such a transition, a reflection of how thoroughly the past year had reshaped everyone involved. He came to Dario's penthouse the evening before his formal installation, uncharacteristically nervous, seeking something from his brother that Celeste suspected he'd never needed before. Reassurance. "Tell me I'm not going to destroy everything Father built," Cassian said, standing at the window, overlooking the city that would soon be, in every meaningful sense, his responsibility to protect. "You're not the same man who disappeared on his own wedding day," Dario said. "You've spent a year proving that. I wouldn't be stepping back if I believed otherwise." "And if I fail?" "Then I'll be here," Dario said simply. "Not as the head of this family, but as your brother. That's not going anywhere, Cassian, regardless of who holds the title." Cassian studied his brother for a long moment, something moving behind his eyes that looked, for the first time since Celeste had known him, entirely without guile. "I don't know if I ever properly thanked you," he said, "for finding me at that restaurant. For actually listening when I told you about the Volkov meetings, instead of simply believing the worst. Most men in your position wouldn't have given me that chance." "You're my brother," Dario said, as though the explanation required nothing further. "I was angry. I had every right to be. But anger isn't the same as certainty, and I owed you the truth before I owed you punishment." The installation ceremony itself, held at the Westchester estate 3 days later, was smaller and quieter than Dario and Celeste's wedding had been. No cathedral, no 600 witnesses, just the family's inner circle, gathered to formally acknowledge what had already, in every practical sense, become true.
Cassian stood at the head of the same long dining table where his father had once assessed Celeste like an asset, and accepted the mantle of leadership with a gravity that would have seemed impossible to imagine a year earlier. Salvatore, seated to his son's right, watched the proceedings with an expression Celeste recognized now as genuine peace, the particular relief of a man who had spent decades believing the Empire's survival depended entirely on his own iron control, finally allowing himself to trust that the next generation might carry it forward in a different shape, built on lessons learned through betrayal and near catastrophe, rather than fear alone. Vittorio's absence hung over the ceremony like a ghost, unspoken, but present in every careful glance Salvatore cast toward the empty chair that had once been reserved for his oldest friend at every family gathering. Thomas's absence, too, weighed on Isabella throughout the proceedings, though she stood beside Celeste with a composure that suggested she'd made a kind of peace with the loss of a brother whose weakness had nearly destroyed everything she loved. "It's strange," Isabella said quietly to Celeste, watching Cassian accept congratulations from family members and allied captains alike. "A year ago, I would have told you this family was defined by strength, by power. Now I think it's defined by what everyone survived to get here." Celeste thought of the cathedral where this had all begun, of Salvatore's voice announcing a marriage that had upended her entire life without her consent, of the cold, controlled stranger who had promised her safety in a marriage neither of them had chosen. She thought of midnight conversations in a study full of evidence, of a warehouse where she'd faced down a man who believed her death would break the empire she'd married into, of a small house upstate where she and Dario had begun building something entirely their own. "I think you're right," she said to Isabella. Strength was never really the point. Surviving what you love enough to keep choosing it, even when everything tells you to walk away, that's the actual foundation this family's built on. Everything else is just decoration. That night, back at the upstate house that had slowly filled with furniture and photographs and the small accumulated evidence of an actual shared life, Dario found her on the porch, watching stars she'd rarely had the chance to see clearly from the city. "Regrets?" he asked, settling beside her, his arm coming around her shoulders in a gesture that had become, over the past year, as natural as breathing. "None," Celeste said, leaning into him. "You?" "Only that it took a wedding, a betrayal, a kidnapping, and my entire family's near collapse to finally understand what I actually wanted," Dario said, something almost rueful in his voice. "I could have saved myself considerable trouble if I'd simply recognized it the moment you looked at me across that cathedral." A year to the day after the wedding that had rearranged both their lives without their consent, Dario and Celeste stood together in the small chapel near their upstate house. No cathedral this time, no 600 witnesses, no father's shocking announcement upending everything either of them had believed about their future. Just the two of them, renewing vows that had begun as an arrangement built entirely on duty and survival and had become, through a year of shared danger and hard-won trust, something neither of them had ever expected to find. "I didn't choose you," Dario said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath it, holding both her hands as the small gathering of family watched. Salvatore, frailer now but present, Cassian standing as his brother's witness with Isabella beside him, Marco and Enzo present as much as family as any bloodline could claim. "Not at first. My father chose you for me, in a cathedral, in front of people who expected a wedding,
and instead witnessed something closer to a hostage exchange. I want you to know that everything I feel for you now, I chose entirely on my own. Every day since that wedding, I've chosen you. I intend to keep choosing you for the rest of my life. Celeste felt tears she didn't bother hiding, a year's worth of fear and danger and slow, unlikely healing crystallizing into this single moment. "I chose the wrong DeSantis, brother," she said, echoing words that had once defined the worst day of her life and now, impossibly, described the best decision she'd never actually gotten to make herself. "Except I didn't, did I? I chose exactly right, even though I never knew it was a choice at all until the moment your father said your name in that cathedral." "You could have hated me," Dario said, "for the position I put you in, for the arrangement that gave you no say at all in your own future." "I could have," Celeste agreed. "And there were nights in those first weeks when I did, but you never once treated me like an obligation, Dario. Not really. You gave me the truth when you could have given me comfortable lies. You protected me when protecting me cost you everything. You loved me before either of us understood what that word would actually require. That's not the behavior of a man who saw me as a debt to be paid. That's the behavior of a man who was, somehow, already falling in love with a woman he'd only just met." The ceremony that followed was brief, quiet, entirely unlike the spectacle of their original wedding, vows spoken not as duty, but as genuine choice, rings exchanged not as symbols of an alliance forced by circumstance, but as promises freely made by two people who had survived betrayal, conspiracy, and near catastrophic loss, to find something worth protecting above every empire either of their families had ever built. Afterward, as the small gathering moved to celebrate at the upstate house that had become their true home, Salvatore approached Celeste alone, his frail hand finding hers with a gentleness that surprised her, given everything that had passed between them since that first stilted dinner where he'd studied her like an asset. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, "for the position I put you in, for treating your future like a transaction rather than a life. I told myself at the time that it was necessary, that the family's survival required sacrifices I had no right to demand of anyone else. But watching what you and Dario built together this past year, I understand now that I got fortunate in ways I didn't deserve. You could have been broken by what I did to you. Instead, you became the reason my son found something in himself he'd never known was missing." "You didn't get fortunate," Celeste said gently. "You got a son who chose, every single day since that cathedral, to be worthy of the marriage you forced on both of us. That's not luck, Salvatore. That's the man you raised, finally becoming who he was always capable of being." Later that evening, standing on the porch where Dario had once told her he had no regrets beyond the delay in recognizing what he wanted, Celeste watched her husband move through the small gathering of people who had become, over the course of one impossible year, her genuine family. Cassian, laughing at something Isabella had said, more at ease than she'd ever seen him. Salvatore, seated comfortably near the fire, watching his sons with the particular peace of a man who had finally seen his family survive, not through fear and control, but through love that had proven, against every expectation, stronger than the empire that had first demanded it. Dario found her there, eventually, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his chin resting against her hair, as they watched the small, hard-won piece of the life they'd built together.
"They're calling us the greatest love story the DeSantis family's ever produced," he murmured against her ear, "which is somewhat absurd, given that it started with a cathedral full of people watching my father humiliate my brother and force a stranger into marrying me instead." "Every great love story starts somewhere absurd," Celeste said, turning in his arms to face him, the man who had once been a cold stranger promising safety, and had become, through a year of shared danger and slow, deliberate trust, the truest home she'd ever known. "Ours just happened to start with a wedding meant for someone else entirely." "I would marry you in that same cathedral tomorrow," Dario said, "knowing everything it would cost us, every threat, every danger, every sleepless night hunting traitors in my own family. I would choose all of it again, Celeste, as long as it ended here, with you." "Then I suppose," Celeste said, rising onto her toes to press her lips against his, "we chose exactly the right ending, even if neither of us got to choose the beginning." Above them, the stars spread endless and quiet across a sky far from the glittering towers of the city where this had all begun. And Dario DeSantis, the wolf of Manhattan, the man an entire underworld had learned to fear, held his wife beneath that vast, indifferent sky, and understood finally that the greatest empire he would ever build was the one neither fear nor duty had constructed. A home, chosen freely, with the one person who had never once needed him to be anything other than exactly who he was.